Welcome to Learn to Live Stress-Free. This is Christine Wright with Dr. Robert Wright Jr., your go-to wellness coaches of www.stressfreenow.info. Our featured guest today is Lee Weber, who will speak with us about the pain and debilitating effects of addiction. Lee is the editor-in-chief of Addiction Blog, and she has made it her mission to inform others about addiction treatments and its options. As a woman in long-term recovery from addiction, Lee is interested in alternative treatments that work and help people get to the root cause of addiction, psycho-emotional issues. This passion translates from real life to online media, where Lee combines communications, content creation, and community development to assist and provide hope to others in need of recovery. You can get in touch with her at lee@addictionblog.org. Audience, welcome. Hello, Lee. Thank you so much for being our featured guest today.
Hi. Nice to be here. Thanks for having me.
You're very welcome.
Great, Lee. It's so wonderful to have you. An audience, you are in for a treat. We have Lee coming from a far distance away, and I'm sure she'll talk a little bit about that. Lee, would you tell our audience and please share your personal story of recovery and about the origins of your addiction blog?
Sure, absolutely. Some might say that I was on the low end of the drug and alcohol problem, and most real addicts would laugh at me when I said that my drug of choice was marijuana. But I was really a weed head. I was a total dope head, and when I couldn't get marijuana, I would drink. I started noticing a problem when I started craving marijuana. And about 9 to 11% of all users actually end up addicts like myself. So that was when I was waking up, before I went to work. And it was normalized in the social setting where I was. I was living in Boulder, Colorado at the time. And most of the time I was high. But after the fun part, and this is in my 20s, when I started drinking, when I got to Africa, because there was no marijuana available there, I was in the Peace Corps. And I started blackout drinking, and I started getting into fights and just generally disrespecting myself. And when I was 27, I hit a wall. And I had to face and resolve my family of origin issues. And those were relating to psychological and emotional connections with my parents. And at the root of any addiction, I believe, is pain, anger, and the inability just to cope with life. And I was definitely there. So I have also learned that we're all looking to feel connected. And because I didn't have the tools to resolve these issues, I fell into a use pattern. And first it was, I knew this from the time I was a kid. It was boys. I would try to escape into boys. And then it was weed. And then it was alcohol. And I was the perfect storm for addiction because I had a genetic predisposition, add environmental conditions. For me, euphoric effect is felt much stronger than most people. And then I had these unresolved psycho-emotional issues going on because addiction is also in my family genes. So in my family, we have compulsive behaviors like gambling, we have drug dependence, and we have drinking problems. I wanted to ask you guys a question, actually. Do you know someone with a drug or alcohol problem?
Yes.
Of course. Everyone does.
That's right. Exactly.
There's an epidemic going on in the United States right now of especially heroin and meth.
Exactly. We all know someone that struggles with addiction. And because it's becoming less stigmatized, it's a good movement at this point in time to actually start talking about these and opening up about it. So even though I don't talk about my own personal story very much, I kind of keep that lower. Like I try to keep it under a low profile. But in talking about it, if I can help one person, at least, just even one person, just to get out of it, then my goals are met. And when I hit my bottom, I was in West Africa, and I was what you would call a high-functioning addict. But it took me about 7 years to get there. So I was living and working around the world. I'd lived in the UK. I was living in Bahrain, Uganda. I had a short-term contract in. I was in Thailand and Benin. And it took a couple of no-nonsense friends, female friends, to confront me. They talked about their concern, and then I was ready for help. So for me, I had to change everything. My whole plan just fell to pieces. I went to rehab. I did 6 months in a sober house. I did 70 12-step meetings in 90 days. They say 90 in 90 days, but I mean, I got to 70. And AA and 12-step became a part of my life. But the main thing, that the real turn was that I got into a relationship with myself and I started digging into a spiritual practice. So that's kind of my recovery story, is that it was this perfect storm. Somebody confronted me. I was ready for help and I got it. And I started Addiction Blog as a way to understand the brain disease of addiction. So it's my personal exploration, because I wasn't satisfied by the definition of addiction as a chronic relapsing condition. Because part of rehab is they do some psychoeducation on you. So they teach you how does the brain work. And they told us, okay, it's a chronic relapsing condition. I was like, okay, but what does that mean? So I broke it down topic by topic by drug. So I started writing with the goal of understanding effects of stimulants versus opiates versus central nervous system depressants, and I kind of tackled it from all of these different gateways. And I saw an opportunity to help others get into treatment at the same time, and it started having a snowball effect. So from 3,000 readers, it grew to 10,000, and now we're at about 1.5 million readers a month, delivering different types of content. So we do graphics, videos, interviews, book reviews, but at the core of it was my personal exploration. What is addiction? Why did I get addicted? And how can I help others?
Lee, thank you so much. You have said a mouthful. I actually signaled to Bob, I have to jump in here to just really highlight some of the extraordinary things that you have said. In our coaching and in our personal journey in life, we find you mentioned relationship with self, and that is so much the stuff of life, because when we can have a loving relationship with ourselves and connect to spirit, then we can really transcend our stories. Because I think many people, you talk about your personal journey, but there are many, many of us who the stuff of life is also resolving those emotional issues, relationship issues with our family of origin. And I think human beings are far more sensitive and delicate than we sometimes realize, because we're also resilient and strong. But many, like yourself, high-functioning people are self-medicating by abusing, substances. So that was you said a mouthful. You said a mouthful.
Thank you. Yeah. I think there's a reason we're connecting also, because I think people use drugs without knowing really why they're using at the beginning. And it becomes a habit, as I'll talk about a little bit more, because I'll dig into the brain part of it. But at the base, at the root of all of problem, I think, with drug and alcohol use is that we're seeking something, and it's not outside of ourselves.
Correct. Yes, I agree. Just as a segue, can you just go down a little bit deeper on that issue in terms of, from your perspective, what are the factors that make someone more susceptible to being addicted, and then what, if anything, can be done to prevent someone from starting down the path that might lead to addiction? I know those are big questions, but I know that you're up to speed on that, because this is a huge issue worldwide, actually. It's not just here in the United States.
That's right. And I'm not a neuroscientist, but as an inquisitive kind of journalist, because that's how I consider myself, I really wanted to understand it. I have to do the research. So I went to the sources, and I went to the National Institute of Drug Abuse, to Casa Columbia, and then interviews with experts, MDs, psychiatrists. Here's what I learned. Genetics make up about 50% of the risk for addiction, and the rest seems to be environmental. So things like your home environment growing up, early developmental trauma itself, just if you've had an experience of trauma or loss, friends and social norms or expectations around drinking or using drugs, when combined with biological factors, such as a family history of addiction or your individual response to drugs and alcohol, make some people more at risk than others of becoming addicts. But still, not all people who use alcohol and drugs are going to become addicted or even physically dependent on them, or even want to use these substances regularly. So how do you prevent addiction? That's the next question, right? Like, it's more complex than just say no. Because I grew up in the Nancy Reagan era. I remember them delivering to us videos of like crack babies being born and people on PCP jumping out of windows and like all of this information. Abstinence-based conditioning hasn't worked to date, right? So you can't prevent it just by scaring people out of it. The war on drugs has been a disaster, in my opinion, and school-based education has questionable outcomes. So what's next? Here's what I've come to. I think that we need to have a broader perspective and understand a little bit of the brain science about how our brains are programmed. Do you remember, did you guys see the films What the Bleep Do We Know or The Secret?
Yes, I believe I know I'd seen all The Secret. I believe I'd seen some part of What the Bleep Do We Know. They're, sort of in there in our memory banks.
I read the book and I have actually used it extensively in some of my research.
Right. It was like foundational for me in understanding kind of metaphysics, and I think for your audience, if they haven't seen those films or read the founding documents, I would recommend them. But the idea of brain patterning was introduced to me through those books, and it's such a foundational idea. I'd like to explain just the basics of it. Is that we have these nerve cells. These nerve cells fire transmitters and neurotransmitters, which are chemicals, and create paths in our brains, right? And those paths, if we use the same path over time, it's like pushing a wheelbarrow into the ground. They become engorged. They actually become deeper and deeper connected. So a great deal of the chemically induced brain damage that takes place normally in the prefrontal cortex, where when you're abusing a drug, you start to have a deep emotional connection between using and pleasure that the brain remembers. So when you're taking a drug, pleasure, ding, love it, go back. Pleasure, ding, love it, go back, right? And these connections make it difficult for people to quit. So it's a very real and a powerful primal urge that can take years to reset. But what neuroscience is teaching us now is that addiction goes even beyond the drug itself. So I did a recent interview with Dr. Howard Wetzman, who's a leading addiction psychiatrist in New Orleans. And he was telling me, and this is his quote, "The question of prevention becomes entirely different when you stop thinking about drugs causing addiction and start thinking about addiction being a primary brain illness." So what does that mean? Specifically, addiction genes haven't been identified yet, but low dopamine tone in the brain can propel us into using chemicals to try to feel normal. So we know dopamine is that feel-good drug. They have found and located a receptor gene called let me just say, I have to read it here, A1 allele of the dopamine D2 receptor. Okay, so they've identified this gene in a third of the population, especially with people who have alcoholism in their bloodlines. And they have found that a third of the population has a low density of dopamine D2 receptors in the reward center of the brain. And it makes it difficult for us to feel normal. A third of the population. We typically feel a little bit depressed. So Dr. Wetzman is saying, again, I quote, "We need to pay more attention to that primary problem, the one that exists before the first drug or drink, the primary symptom of addiction that leads to using. This is the primary genetics of lower dopamine tone." So certain genes can make it harder. Certain genes like this can make it harder for you to quit once you start using drugs. Withdrawal can be more difficult. Functional life stress lowers reduced dopamine activity. And when combined with early trauma, early developmental stuff, quitting just doesn't become an option for most people. So if we can't prevent the biology, what can we prevent? We can prevent its progression. So the key is early identification of addiction, early intervention, good treatment, and lifelong continued care. So if you're a drug or alcohol user, if you drink, or if you use drugs, here are my suggestions. These are my personal suggestions for you. The first would be honest with yourself. So when you're taking a pain med or your stimulant, an ADHD medication given by a doctor, are you using them as prescribed? Do you take more regularly than prescribed? Are you taking them as prescribed? So that means no snorting, no IV injection, no chewing, and are you taking more than prescribed? And if you can get honest about that and report on yourself, then you have less likelihood of becoming addicted. And then second, if you're drinking, are you within the social norms? Not the social norms, I'm sorry. These are targeted norms that are from the National Institute of Alcoholism. And they say, for women, 1 drink a day or no more than 7 drinks a week is okay. That's moderate. But if you go more than that, then you might have a problem. For men, that's 2 drinks a day or no more than 14 drinks a week. And then if you're binge drinking, if you're drinking like 5 or more drinks in one setting, it might be time to look at those behaviors. So after you're honest with yourself and you've kind of taken an inventory, then my second suggestion is note and report increases in tolerance. Because just because you're drug dependent or drug tolerant doesn't mean you're drug addicted. But it's always good to check in with a medical doctor. And then third, be careful when you're using any kind of substance for effect. Knowing the risks of your own biology can prevent you from real pain down the road. I think this might be interesting too for your audience members who are parents, because I'm a parent myself. I have a 6-year-old son and I'm expecting a baby girl in a month. And I often wonder, well, how can I prevent addiction for my kids, right? I know I'm an addict. I know that I have it in my family, and so there's a 50-50 chance, right? So here are some things that parents can do. If you have a family history of addiction, look for, number 1, signs of abnormal attachment to certain behaviors. These behaviors that are known to raise dopamine. So you're not looking for a sweet tooth, but you're looking for a kid who's only happy when he's eating. Or not a kid that likes video games, but one that is only functioning well when he's watching new visual stimuli. Those are 2 signs. Okay, so look for things that activities known to raise dopamine and a distortion there. The second would be conscious of your own messaging as a parent. So avoid shaming or making your kid feel less than. These kinds of things lower dopamine in a child, and they're cyclical, right? So then a child is seeking to feel better, so they're going to go outside of themselves. Third, don't let your child be physically isolated unless they want moments of privacy. The best thing we can do, I think, as parents, though, is ask ourselves all the time, is this good for my child? Whatever it is, every day, is this good for my child? Because when we make a choice to put their wishes and conveniences ahead, when we want to do that for ourselves, when we want like our own wishes, whatever it is that is in front of us at the moment, if we put it ahead of our kids, there's going to be consequences to it. Even if we don't think our kids are not noticing in the moment, they're picking up everything. So those would be my guidelines for prevention. Sorry, I feel like I'm on a bit of a diatribe here, but I get passionate about it.
It's a beautiful diatribe.
Okay.
Well, Lee, you touched on so many things, and so what it means is that we're going to have you back. However, let me just say this. One of the things that's clear from what you mentioned in the research, the genetic component just addresses 1/3 of the population. So that means it's 2/3 where there's not the genetic predisposition. And then the other issue in terms of addiction is not just dopamine.
Right.
There are other key neurotransmitters and hormones such as oxytocin, GABA, serotonin, which plays a key role. Also, in terms of stress, the nitric oxide, whether or not it's flatline or spiked. So we are going to have you come back because you've opened a large door, and part of that large door that you open is talking about the home setting, and then this other issue when kids are in school, the bullying issue, because, you mentioned stress and trauma. So if a kid is being bullied, sometimes the bullying is actually even taking place inside their home. They could be being bullied by a parent, they could be bullied by a sibling, or a next door neighbor. So all of those things compound someone who, as you said, might be predisposed and can lead to bad outcomes. So at this point, I'd like to let our audience know that we'll be back in a moment on Learn to Live Stress-Free. Our featured guest today, Lee Weber.
Dr. Robert Wright Jr., the stress relief doctor, is the co-host of the Learn to Live Stress-Free Now podcast series. He is an author, speaker, and stress management wellness coach. Dr. Bob's published study is the first to show the connection between stress reduction, grief recovery, nitric oxide spiking, and the relaxation response, and his practical application of this knowledge helps you relieve the stresses of everyday life. Dr. Bob has the tools to dissolve your pain points quickly and effectively. Email him to find out how you can start to feel better now at stressfreenow.info/contact. That's stressfreenow.info/contact. Have you been procrastinating about completing an important project or pursuing a treasured dream? Hi, I'm Christine Wright. I help you recognize and play to your strengths. I show you how to quickly build your confidence, to uncover and eliminate your habitual patterns of resistance and self-sabotage. I help you discover those meaningful insights that will get you to do what works so you can celebrate your successes. Go to stressfreenow.info/contact to let me know that you're ready to live your ideal life now. Again, that's stressfreenow.info/contact.
Welcome back to Learn to Live Stress-Free. We're speaking today with Lee Weber, editor of addictionblog.org.
Lee, I have to say, I am so thrilled listening to your extraordinarily clear and comprehensive coverage of a topic which you obviously know at the expert level. You know, before the commercial break, you mentioned quite a few things that I'd like to, again, highlight. When you talk about this need, and so many of us are externally driven, and it's really that internal drive of feeling complete with ourselves. Certainly, with the information that we have today from psychology and neuroscience, we're learning so much more about how we work as human beings. And, that knowledge is being spread more and more, thankfully, but there's still many people who are not aware of it. And what you talk about, and Bob and I find in our practice as coaches, when we work with people, a lot of the debilitating and weakening behavior is this culture of blame, of shame, of justification, of defensiveness, of comparing ourselves. And when we look outside ourselves and we see things in the world, we do have that feeling, some of us, of being less than, and we try to fill it in some way. And Bob and I have found, again, in our work, that it's so important to have some spiritual aspect to our life, whether it's connecting to nature, in some way connecting to something greater than ourselves, because when your thoughts overcome you, that's really when it's much easier to go down a wrong path. When you start to look, is there something wrong with me and I'm different, to take people out of their emotional and psychological woundedness. You have covered this quite a bit already, but what are the other factors, if you could really highlight that again, that make people more susceptible? In your introduction, I read you talked about, the psycho-emotional factors. And again, what you have already said, I think it's worth repeating these things and highlighting and expanding. Really, what prevents someone from starting on that path? If someone's not watching you from the outside, from the inside, Lee, you talked about telling the truth. Do you see it happening? Do you ignore it? Do you just keep moving forward and knowing that you're going down a wrong path? Or were you oblivious, or others who are addicts? What's their level of recognizing and saying, hey, I need to change something? What's that point that makes people change?
Yeah. It's different for everybody. Some people might hit a bottom when they have nothing left, and they're selling themselves on the streets. That's the reality of some of the harsher drugs too. That's what heroin or meth can do to you. For me personally, I feel like I'd never had a voice in my family. I'm the firstborn. I'm the first child, and I have the burden of being the firstborn. But first of all, I was kind of lost in a search. I knew I was searching for something, but I didn't quite know what it was. So the drugs and the alcohol were simply a way for me to try to access actually that deeper part of myself, which is weird because they got me further and further away from it. So
Right.
once the ideas were presented, I really grasped them. I was ready. I was ready for it. I was ready to go through the spiritual journey. Other people might hesitate to think or experience or, I don't know, even consider that there is a spiritual or connected element to addiction. And that's why there are other programs like Smart Recovery or Sobriety SOS or Rational Recovery, so that they can go through and do the psychological work without having to have an element of spirituality or higher powerness. For me, it wasn't a problem. But there are these other programs which allow you to go through and evaluate your behavior and to say, okay, what is the plus? What is the minus? What are my pros and cons of doing this? And is it worthwhile seeking either maybe moderation in that? Because it's a spectrum too. It's not just all abstinence anymore. It's like, can I get to a point where maybe my use isn't harming me as much? Can I reduce it? Or do I need to quit totally? Because outcomes generally are about 30-30-30. So if you look at like a third of the population is going to get better. There are 23 million Americans that we estimate are in long-term recovery from addiction. So a third of us have done well. There's about a third of the people who will continue using until the end of their days. And then there's a third of the people who they will use and they will end up overdosing, or they will end up dying younger than they should. That's the honesty part of it. So whether or not a person is ready to abstain or not, getting honest with yourself can be as simple as making a list of pros and cons. In Smart Recovery, it's called the ABCs. And you can go to Smart Recovery website, and they have worksheets that you can do where you're actually just putting your life on paper and you're saying, okay, this is what it does for me, and this is what it does badly for me. This is why I do it. This is a plus. This is the minus. And am I ready to make a choice? Because it's all about stages of change as well. You can't force anybody into recovery, but they have to be willing to make that first change. And people come to it at different points. They say that there's like an elevator or an escalator. And my first sponsor in AA told me, you're lucky that you got off the elevator relatively early. You didn't go down to the bottom and crash, but you would have ended up there, So I'm grateful for that. I'm grateful that I was ready and willing to accept the help. And if somebody's out there that's struggling with addiction, they just need to know that there are multiple methods and multiple ways of getting clean and sober. It's not just all 12-step anymore. That if you do also there's just one thing you have to do, and that's ask for help. And then when you open that door, then other doors will open. So,
Lee, I'm just listening to you, and I'm just thinking, you keep opening doors. I'm going, we have to do another show, because you have touched on a couple of things here that one of the things that Christine and I talk about regularly is this issue of family dynamics, and how family dynamics, some people call them family Olympics, can especially in the area of trauma, how people are traumatized, both sometimes physically, mentally, emotionally. So here would be an example. Easy example would be, a kid is 8 years old and having difficulty in school, and the parent or some adult says to them, could be a teacher even, well, you're not smart and you're not college material. And so something as simple as that, if the child accepted that, their mind, their unconscious accepted that, that could lead to a whole bunch of bad outcomes in the future. Also, what occurred to me is how the bullying takes place, especially now it's in elementary school, but in middle school, where a kid is doing well in school, and sometimes that causes problems. Other kids are saying, oh, you think you're smart, and then that becomes a problem for them, because the whole issue is of fitting in. And then this other larger issue, which I wanted to bring up, is about judgment, because that's something that Christine and that's throughout all societies, actually, and I think that perhaps is a part of the addiction equation that's little talked about, how people are judged in society, and as Christine indicated, made to feel less than And that can be coming from so many angles in terms of you're not wearing the right sneakers, or you don't have that T-shirt, or whatever. It's usually something silly. But when, especially kids are at the formative ages where their ego is still being formed, and if they care about belonging to the group, and that's another aspect that I think that plays into addiction, is that when people have strong affiliative needs where they want to hang out with the cool kids, that's how, unfortunately, they get into situations where they're exposed to things, like drugs. They're at a party and then things are happening. Whereas if they weren't at that party, especially at younger ages, they might have a better chance. What do you think about that?
So peer pressure, acceptance. Here's what I think. I think that until we have one person who can show us unconditional love and who is modeled for us, then we're lost, right? Until we can either be taught how to love unconditionally ourselves and then generate it for ourselves and attract it to ourselves. Sometimes it takes just one person from the outside to just really love you through something. And I think that it's an indicator of our American society and the disconnect that we have. Because I live in the Balkans, and I can see a different society and how it operates. This culture is much different from America in that you don't just have the kids that you grew up with are there for you for life. There is a connection between people that is palpable. You can call somebody on the phone with a problem, and they'll show up in the middle of the night and help you change a tire, for example. There's a connectedness. And I think that at the root of American culture, the individualism has really blasted us apart to this real fight or flight, right? Like we're in a stress mode all the time, trying to be accepted, trying to find our place. So it hits everything. It hits everything. But I think that that love is the way through it.
Lee, you just went through another door, existential grief. Well, Christine is smiling over here. I want to thank you for that answer. That is so beautiful what you said about unconditional love. And I think with that, you have hit the nail on the head, because when a person can say, I am love, or I feel love, or I love myself. George Benson did a song, The Greatest Love of All, and I think Whitney Houston sang that also. And that he said in the lyrics, it says, learning to love yourself is the greatest love of all. And I think you really hit on something there in terms of the addiction. When you ask the person, how do you really feel about yourself? And then the issue is when the person is honest, right? And they'll often say, well, they don't feel good about themselves, or well, this happened to me, or that happened to me. And as you said, there's some aspect of trauma, whether it's physical, emotional, mental. And we just did an interview yesterday, and it came up. Christine's signature article is entitled Sticks and Stones, which talks about how adults sometimes say unintentionally or sometimes intentionally harsh words to children, and how that plays out later in their life. And I hadn't, at the time she said that, thought of it in the context of addiction, but it would be true. And I'm thinking of a case where I remember when we lived in Brooklyn, I was in the elevator, and a woman came in with her granddaughter. I think the granddaughter was 3 or 4 years old, and then they weren't going to the lobby. They were just going to another floor. And the girl, I don't know, the door opened, and she was taking too long, and her grandmother said something. She goes, "Oh, I'm gonna leave you," something like that. And both myself and another person who was on the elevator, we looked on in horror, because we realized that we saw the visceral response of the little 3 or 4 year girl, and she started to cry. And the lady standing next to me, she said, "Oh, your grandmother didn't mean that. She would never abandon you." Because again, if at 3 or 4 years old, the fear of abandonment, and so something as simple as that, that could play out later in addiction. I hadn't thought about that, but it's not a good outcome. And so, fortunately, the lady standing next to me, she hugged the little girl and said, "Oh, your grandma didn't mean that. She was just playing with you. She would never do anything. She would never leave you." You see what I'm saying? So that hurt, and so that's one of the reasons pets, for example, the issue of unconditional love. So I think you really, Lee, have hit the nail on the head. So let me just ask you this, Lee. On your addiction blog, you have an impressive infographics series showing the effects on the brain chemistry and the physiology of substance abuse. I know I was really impressed with the one that you had on marijuana. I was impressed at the level of detail that you're showing the specific brain regions that are affected when someone does marijuana. And, what does the science tell us about the short and long-term changes in the brain, and what role do these changes play in terms of increasing or decreasing the chance of a successful long-term recovery from addiction for a person?
Right. Because the drugs have this very physical, emotional effect that is indisputed. Like, you just can't dispute that this is what the drugs do. So short-term changes on the brain can be activated the first time you use them, recreationally when you use them, even if it's every now and then. But you have to know, every time you use a drug, it's always altering the normal communication of neurons in your brain. And this way it can change your ability to do everyday tasks. So they're not all bad, though. Some of the short-term effects of drugs can be positive. So, for example, this can include feeling confident or energetic or feeling relaxed. The drug can also provoke a sense of intense well-being. That's the high, right? The euphoria. And then drugs work really well for blocking emotional or physical pain, especially the opiate variety. They actually physically block the way that your brain perceives pain. So that's why, everybody coming back from Vietnam got hooked on morphine. It's because morphine, super effective for pain. The negative sides of those, and that's even for one-time use, okay? And if you use drugs, things like, it depends, there's the synthetic cannabinoids right now that are out, Spice and K2. They can provoke hallucinations the first time that you use them, or they can provoke anxiety attacks or extreme paranoia. Irritability is often a side effect of the short-term use of the drugs. But more commonly and kind of generally, there's memory problems and kind of behavioral psychological manifestations that are abnormal, like you might become violent or you might become restless or, again, back to anxiety. It can provoke those kinds of things. But over the long term, and this is what's the most serious, over the long term, there are three major changes to the brain. Number one, you have the reduced ability to feel pleasure. So that's the result of the brain adjusting to the overwhelming release of neurotransmitters, right? So the brain's trying to maintain a homeostasis. So it either produces much less dopamine to account for the more dopamine or serotonin that's being flushed into the synapses, or it reduces even the number of receptors that can process these neurotransmitters. That's the case for meth. Like meth, you'll actually physically start to see nerve cells die out in their receptive ability to kind of capture neurotransmitters. So the natural ability to feel pleasure is impaired. Second, you're going to damage your learning ability. This is the result of altered concentrations of glutamate. You had mentioned GABA, but there's new research going into glutamate at this moment. That's very exciting. But that is going to affect your ability to retain information. So as drug abuse changes the brain, then your cognitive functions become impaired. And then third is there's a physical manifestation of powerlessness and an uncontrollable need for drugs. And this is the thing that I think most of the public doesn't understand about drug use. They still try to moralize it and say, why doesn't a person just stop? Well, the thing is that it's a chemical process. So there are changes in the brain, in the non-conscious memory systems of the brain at the prefrontal cortex. It kind of goes offline when you use certain types of drugs. And what happens is it's going to start to drive a constant and compulsive pursuit of the drugs. And the result is a loss of control. So you basically become powerless over the drug. You have these uncontrollable cravings. Those happen often for cocaine, meth, heroin, opiates, opioids, so prescription drugs like hydrocodone, oxycodone, so that you just become powerless over it, and your decision-making process can shut down. So the roles that these have in decreasing your chances of successful long-term recovery are that when you have a reduced ability to feel pleasure, you feel incomplete without the drug, and you need to take it just to feel normal, right? So they provide a somewhat normal function for you because your brain's just depleted of neurotransmitters. And then secondly, when you experience an uncontrollable need for drugs, your life becomes unmanageable. It becomes all about seeking the drug, getting the drug, and consuming the drug. And this is a hijack situation, though, because the drugs have hijacked your brain to the point where you can't make decisions for yourself. And even later in sobriety, even if you haven't had the drug for a long time, but you have a trigger, maybe it's a lighter, it's like the sound of a lighter. It could be a sound, it could be a visual. These kind of triggers, a smell, they're going to wake up the craving, and they can seriously compromise your sobriety. And sometimes people get to the point where they could be 6 months sober, 8 months sober, and they'll have a trigger, and then all of a sudden they're right back into where they were, 6-8 months before, using. So that's kind of the short and the long-term kind of synopsis. And on Addiction Blog, we try to visualize that so people can look at it by drug. So you can see that by going to our drop-down menu and then searching for the drug that you're interested in.
Thank you, Lee. I just want to say you have an extraordinary body of work, and leveraging your personal experience of recovery, of helping yourself to have this source of enormous, extensive, high-quality information is a gift to, as you said, millions. So I want to acknowledge you and thank you for your work. There's something to, in this whole process of addiction and recovery, could you talk about the challenges to family and friends of an addict? And I think there's one thing that, I've noticed in other people's behavior when sometimes when we see something going wrong, whether we're not ready to handle it, we pretend that nothing's going on, and we may let something go on longer than it should, or we don't know how to stop it. And what is the aspect of forgiveness in this process of recovery, whether feeling betrayed or let down by a spouse, by a child, by a family member? And many times, Bob and I have seen in our practice, it is some, as Bob mentioned before, some trauma, and as you spoke to, something going on in the home, whether it's psychological abuse, physical abuse, or watching a parent who had some type of, addiction. That how does this play out in the family and relationship dynamic?
Right. Well, the two challenges for families are denial of the problem, like you said, and then enabling the problem. But there are two solutions which are corresponding to that. So to counteract the denial, you just need to get honest. And to counteract enabling, you need to learn how to set boundaries. But most of the time you need professional help because whatever you've been doing isn't working. You set up the dysfunction. It's working in some respects, but the power of denial is simply as a defense mechanism to change. We can ignore or reject what's in front of us because we don't unconsciously perhaps we don't want things to change. So when you're trapped in a cycle of dysfunction and addiction becomes a signal for change, it can be hard. And blaming is much easier. So I created an example of a teenager, like there's a teenage daughter. Let's say that there's somebody who's often left home at school, after school, at home. Maybe her parents are workaholics, or maybe they're divorced, or maybe they're overly critical, or they're being emotionally abusive. Well, if she's introduced to painkillers from a friend, bingo, she's off to the races. Her friends change, her priorities can change, and now she's partying. And if she starts mixing other drugs up, she can start to experience really serious consequences very quickly. And often that's when parents will notice, oh my gosh, my teenager has a problem. And they see it, oh, my teenager's out of control. But in reality, they need to be looking at their own behaviors and their own values and their own systems. So when you begin with honesty and you can seek professional help through a family therapist or a psychologist who specializes in addiction, or look at a systemic approach like CRAFT. Now, CRAFT is an alternative to an intervention, not those interventions we see on TV where the family sits down, everybody's tearful, and, it's like, you have to go to addiction treatment or else. No, CRAFT is teaching families how to communicate over time with an addict. I would refer your audience to a really great group in Massachusetts called Allies in Recovery. They're using the CRAFT model and have been for a decade. And CRAFT is called it's community reinforcement and family training. Basically, you need to set up your system so that the system no longer supports the addict in the addiction, but starts to remove rewards. And it cannot be taught in one session. It's taught over the course of 12 to 6 weeks. But the outcomes are wonderful. It's like 70 to 80% of people who are using CRAFT after, I think it's like 4 months, have the family member go to treatment. So that's
extraordinary. Those are great results.
Yeah. Aren't they great? I mean, and we don't know about it because it's not at the moment industry trend. But I hope we're moving there.
Can you give that name for that acronym for CRAFT again, Lee?
It's community reinforcement and family training.
Thank you.
So there's CRAFT. So yeah, look for a psychologist or a family counselor that's trained in CRAFT, because what they're going to do is help you with your second problem, which is enabling. Because an enabler, often you don't know that you're enabling because it's unconscious and you're being protective of your loved one and it feels like helping, but you're actually harming the situation really, really poorly. Common examples of enabling could include prioritizing an addict's needs before your own, paying for someone's living, housing, or finances, covering or making excuses for an addict. So like calling into work and being like, oh, my husband's sick today, sorry, bargaining or making deals with the addict that never come through, and then blaming people or situations other than the addict. Enabling behaviors are things we do to prevent someone from addressing addiction with professional help. So the solution is then retraining your family to set boundaries. And that's where CRAFT, I think, is just wonderful. So also alliesinrecovery.net, check out their website. They have modules that you can download and video programming that you can consume so you can understand the model. It's pretty much 3 things: rewarding non-use. So that's when you give attention to someone, is when they're sober. It could be anything from a hug to a pizza to just attention, right? And then you disengage, you remove rewards, and you allow natural consequences if they are using drugs. So they can range from oversleeping to missing work to bailing someone out of jail or paying for their ticket to come back from another country, But the third step is to really work with a professional to come up with a plan, because it's difficult to know how to communicate with someone who's using. What do you do when they relapse? How do you plan addiction treatment? This is where professional help can come into play. And you can always go to the government source. It's called SAMHSA, SAMHSA. They're the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration, because everything in the government is long. It's like, let's make a long acronym. You can go to SAMHSA, and they actually have a treatment reference hotline. It's a 24-hour hotline. I think it's 1-800-662-HELP. And you can call their hotline, and you can be referred to a treatment center near you with sliding scale fees or family programming, whatever needs you have. But I think that those challenges that families face, they really do need to overcome with professional help.
Well, Lee, I have to tell you, we definitely have to have you back. When I was listening to your answer, I felt like I was in the comic book with Batman, where they go boom, pow, bang, because the issues that you brought up, enabling, denial, and certainly blaming, And then when you said the covering, I think everybody has experienced that, and that's not just with addiction, just in general. That let's just be plain, as they say on Broadway, they're lying.
Yeah.
Right? So
Yeah.
there's a lot of lying going on and hiding, and so I want to thank you so very much for being our featured guest today, Lee. You have just brought out so much, and we look forward to having you again.
Oh, it would be my pleasure. This for me has been a process of actually having to kind of commit to a personal stance on addiction, because in creating a summary for your show, what I've had to do is revisit all the research and the interviews that I've done, because you asked some really great questions, in order to help the audience also understand where we are at this point in time, because we're going to be moving forward in our understanding of addiction as well. We're going to have alternative treatments. We're going places, and there is hope. One in three American families are affected by addiction. Anywhere between 8 and 16% of individuals will have a substance use disorder. And mental health issues in the U.S., I really hope, are going to be destigmatized in the next decade or two, because mental health is a part of our health, and it's like we've been ignoring it for decades and centuries. And until we take care of the whole person, part of us is always going to be hurt. So it's my vision that we have kind of healthy, happy people all around the world.
We share that vision, Lee, and we want to thank you so much. My mantra is I have been saying more and more that it's possible for us all to live in bliss and live in peace. And
yeah.
I really believe that, because the information for positive, successful living, it's more available now than ever. Science is really moving forward with ways that we can counteract our weaknesses. And as you mentioned, skills training, sharing of information, and the very important aspects of community and social support really gives us all hope. So Bob and I agree with you on that. So Lee, we want to thank you for being on the show and sharing just such extraordinary information. And could you just again please repeat how our audience can get in touch with you to learn about the resources that you offer?
Sure. Yeah, they can reach me. The best and most direct way is my email. It's Lee, Lee, @addictionblog.org. Or you could visit addictionblog.org itself. There's a contact page there. You can comment on any of our articles, and we respond to those comments. Or you can check out our Twitter and Facebook handles. It's Addiction Blog under both, and send us a message that way.
Excellent. Thank you so much. So again, audience, to get in touch with Lee, just email her at Lee, which is Lee, @addictionblog.org. Check out the website of the same name, addictionblog.org. And again, Twitter and Facebook, same name, Addiction Blog. And you will be able to learn more about all the extraordinary information that Lee has shared with us, and you'll be able to get in touch with her. Again, Lee, we want to thank you for being on the show.
Oh, thank you for having me. Many blessings.
Great, Lee. What final thoughts or key idea would you like our audience to take away from today's broadcast?
We talked a lot about the problem, but I want people to know that there's a solution to addiction. So, first of all, if you're using drugs or alcohol, there's probably a good reason that you are. Trauma, past or present pain, and co-occurring mental health issues are real drivers for substance abuse, and there's nothing to be ashamed of. So while it might seem too much to bear, being clean and sober is so much better. And plus, combinations of medications and psychotherapy can help. So if you're addicted to a stronger drug like an opiate, they have long-term medication use for buprenorphine, methadone, naltrexone, which are giving great results over decades. And we're all in this together. So reach out to someone for help. If it's not me, if it's not Christine and Dr. Bob, reach out, because one step at a time and one day at a time, you can get better.
Great. Thank you so much, Lee. I want to thank you again for being our featured guest today, and I'd like to thank you, our audience, for listening wherever you are and whatever time zone you're in right now. We appreciate your presence and trust that you'll benefit in some way from the information that we delivered during today's show. We welcome and look forward to your comments about our show. Please let us know if there are additional topics you'd like to see us cover or a guest you enjoyed listening to you want us to invite back. Please contact us through our website with your feedback and suggestions. Remember, listeners, if you'd like to get the same benefits our coaching clients get with us, including learning how you can get more ideal results in your day and easy ways to dissolve your chronic pain, stress, and anxiety, then give us a call at 954-900-2179. For Christine Wright, this is Dr. Robert Wright, Jr. of www.stressfreenow.info. Until next time, be safe and be well.